University of Wisconsin professor Jennifer Ratner Rosenhagen. Who is Friedrich Nietzsche?
Friedrich Nietzsche was a 19th century German philosopher who wrote many books of philosophy in all sorts of different forms. And all of them, so some aphoristic, some essayistic, some longer form critiques, and all of them had something to do with the challenge of universal truth. So he took as his enemy the notion of universal truth, and pretty much all of his work has something to do with his effort to tear it down, excavate it, look at the history of that idea, and to show that anything that we take to be universals, like, oh, God, are human creations. But they're not rooted in nature or necessity. They're not mirrors of reality.
He wrote at one time, God is dead.
And he wrote that God is dead. And this first makes its appearance in his Gay Science. And in it, the Gay Science, in it it's an aphorism, and it's called The Madman. And so the aphorism is he's playing with this idea that a madman runs into the town square and says, God is dead, God is dead, we have killed him, you and I. And everybody says, oh, he's crazy, oh, he's crazy. And he realizes, oh, my time has not come yet. And so there he's announcing what's going to be basically his intellectual project for the rest of his writing life before he goes insane, and that is the notion that God is dead. What troubled Nietzsche was that over the course of the 19th century, as in particular Germans became more modern and more secular, that they continued to go to church and pray to a God that they didn't really believe in anymore. In other words, he thought that modern thought, modern science, the forces of modernity were undermining the basis of religion. And yet he said people still held on to it. They still clutched onto it because they were too terrified to live without it. And this he found really despicable. And that's what he tries to work out in his philosophy.
Where did he teach? How did he come about? Was he well known in his time?
Nietzsche, well, we have to sort of separate the myth from the reality, which is that Nietzsche did have moments of modest fame. Actually, his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, had a pretty big reception, but then he did fade into obscurity. He was a philology professor in Basel, so a professor of language, the history of language, the genealogy of language. But the academic life wasn't for him. He suffered from a lot of physical ailments, so, I mean, historians and philosophers debate why did he have such a tough time in the academy? Although some of us in the academy nowadays don't wonder that much. But anyway, Nietzsche taught for 10 years in Basel with some success, but due to reasons that we can only sort of imperfectly suss out, was it his health? Was it what he said, which is that he needed to break free? Nietzsche breaks free, lives on a pension the rest of his life, and gets to inhabit the image of the free thinker that he so exalts and worships in his own philosophy. But Nietzsche didn't have a huge readership for most of his productive life. And I say productive life because in 1889 he has a nervous collapse and spends the last 11 years of his life in a very declining state. I mean, and ends up in a totally vegetative state, and dies in 1900. He's discovered, so how does Nietzsche become Nietzsche? He's discovered precisely in those months when his health is declining, shortly before this mental collapse. So one of the terrible ironies of Friedrich Nietzsche's life and the posthumous life of his ideas is that it's in the moment when intellectually and mentally, you know, there's a closing of accounts for him. That's the moment when the floodgates open and he becomes the superstar that he is today.
Who discovered him? How was he discovered?
He was discovered. This is a little tricky because there's always a quest for priority. People were reading Nietzsche, but were those people being read? But I think it's fair to say that the Danish critic Georg Brandes, who himself had a big audience in the late 19th century. He is credited with discovering Nietzsche, and I think that's a fair assessment, that he brings the most fame to Nietzsche. And they actually do have a brief correspondence in that last year, just as madness is closing in on Nietzsche. And Nietzsche thinks, finally, someone recognizes my genius. And then, lo and behold, he has a mental collapse in Turin, and that's pretty much the end of his productive life. So Brandes is credited largely with kind of getting the word out in Northern European circles that Nietzsche is one to watch. And that's when Nietzsche's reputation, boom, really takes off.
Who followed him? Who liked his work? What kind of people? What kind of politicians?
Everybody. Atheists, religionists, the left, the right, women, men, black, whites, old people, young people. So Nietzsche, now that's not immediate because he needs to be translated. Nietzsche is not translated in earnest until into the 1896, 1897 is the first round of translations. Then there's another major effort of translations that happened in the early 20th century. Of course, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, a lot of educated Americans could read German, so people were reading him, in the original, but it really did require the translations for him to take off. Henry. Why am I calling him Henry? H.L. Mencken, he didn't go by Henry. H.L. Mencken has a lot to do with Nietzsche's superstardom. Now, it's not to say that there weren't other folks who were reading Nietzsche and popularizing Nietzsche in the United States before Mencken, but Mencken is the one who writes the first full-length monograph on Nietzsche in 1908. And that's where we get a kind of full-on synopsis about Nietzsche's life, his travails, his struggles with Christianity, his struggles with health. We get a little bit about Nietzsche's sexuality. It wouldn't be Mencken if there wasn't a little something racy thrown in. And then we get Nietzsche's ideas, boom. And this book sold widely and sold well. And it helped do two things. It helped really establish Nietzsche's reputation in America, but it did something else, which is, of course, it helped Mencken become Mencken.
So if somebody says, I love Friedrich Nietzsche, I agree with him, what are they saying to you, Professor?
If they're just saying that, not much, because someone, I use the example of chest-thumping atheists and Bible-thumping Christians could both make that claim about Nietzsche. And that's what's so startling about his reception, is that he doesn't track right or left. He doesn't track religious or secular. He tracks all over our intellectual spectrum. So just the statement, I love Nietzsche, doesn't tell me much of anything other than that's an utterly conventional experience to find Nietzsche so powerful. In fact, I think what's so interesting is how many people will say, and have said over the course of the late 19th, 20th century, of course until our own time, how they felt when they read Nietzsche, he was speaking to them personally. So one of the things I argue in the book is that Nietzsche becomes a superstar public philosopher by way of private longings and private fears. So you have a strange look, you have a disturbed look on your face.
No, I'm just wondering, who wouldn't like Friedrich Nietzsche then?
There are plenty of people who don't like Friedrich Nietzsche, and there were things not to like. He didn't say very nice things about democracy. He didn't say very nice things about women. He didn't say very nice things about equality. And so if these are things that matter to you, you're going to take issue with him. So let me give you a concrete example of what's to like and what's not to like about Nietzsche. And oh gosh, I can take anyone, but I'll take one of the more spectacular examples, and that is the Leopold and Loeb trial of 1924. So Leopold and Loeb are two University of Chicago students who think that they are the Übermenschen, that they are what Nietzsche had in mind when he wrote about the Übermenschen, and they wanted to prove it to themselves.
Which is beyond?
The Übermensch is the Superman. it gets translated as the Superman. In fact, the Superman, as in Superman comic, which we tend to think of as, you know, Americana, has its roots in Nietzsche's Übermensch. In fact, the two boys, I don't know, men who come up with Superman were readers of Nietzsche. So it's just a little, and there's many cases like that. I mean, even I think the fact that we have the word Uber, you know, Uber, I think, comes into our language in the way that it does by way of the Übermensch. Anyway, but we're talking about an example where we have two views that say they have the right Nietzsche, and that is Leopold and Loeb. They read Nietzsche, they think that they're the Superman he had in mind, and so they want to prove it to themselves, and so they kidnap and kill a 14-year-old boy, Bobby Franks, in the south side of Chicago. They get caught. It turns out that they weren't so uber as they thought. Clarence Darrow, the famed trial attorney, becomes their defense lawyer. And he's also a reader of Nietzsche, but he's not a murderer. In fact, he's quite sure that that's not what Nietzsche had in mind. And so the interesting thing about the whole Leopold and Loeb trial, which is trying to save these boys from, these young men from being killed themselves, is how Darrow had to both say the reason why they did this is because Nietzsche is toxic and a dangerous thinker, and they misunderstood him, and yet Nietzsche is an important thinker that we need in modern life, but we need to handle him with care. So it's just something like that, the Leopold and Loeb trial. You see those sorts of negotiations where Nietzsche is both, you know, public enemy number one, as we see with a murder, but we also see with Clarence Darrow saying, no, Nietzsche is the thinker that we Americans need in order to embrace modern life.
Political movements that have co-opted Nietzsche.
Oh, so many. I think the one that, I mean, really, the whole 20th century is a story of co-optation. I think the one that surprises my readers the most, or at least when I get letters from readers, or I come into contact with readers, it's Nietzsche, the hidden Nietzschean origins of Black power. So Huey P. Newton was a reader of Friedrich Nietzsche, and in Nietzsche, he discovered a lot of things in Nietzsche, but what he understood from Nietzsche is he needed Nietzsche to tell him that the things that your culture tell you are true and are universal, it's in fact made up. Or it's a product of history, it's a product of chance, it's somewhat arbitrary, but it's not true. And so don't take the voice of a racist culture as the voice of your own inner conscience. Yeah, and this is what, so for Huey P. Newton, this is what Nietzsche did for African Americans, is to help them hear that they no longer had to pray to the white man's God. They no longer had to make themselves prostrate to a religion, in his view, that made them supplicants, and that they shouldn't take this morality, which tries to discipline them and keep them down, as something universal, as something timeless. And so Huey P. Newton is really intellectually, if you will, cutting his teeth on Nietzsche as he and Bobby Seale are coming together and formulating the basis of Black power.
World War II.
The reason why I sigh is I don't know of any other philosopher in history that's blamed for 2 world wars, but Nietzsche was. So you can't, just quickly, World War II I actually think is the more interesting story here, because all the ways in which Nietzsche's reputation is just so terribly damaged. But just quickly, if I may, World War I, Nietzsche, when World War I breaks out, and this is so shocking to American observers, it starts to come out, you know, it's Nietzsche, it's Nietzsche, it's Nietzsche, rumors of German ministers preaching Nietzsche from their pulpits. It wasn't hard to listen and hear traces of Nietzschean philosophy behind the blood and iron imperialism of Germany during World War I. And so Nietzsche is yoked to World War I and has a very hard time, well, those who want to try to save his reputation and say this wasn't what he intended, this is just the misuse of Nietzsche, had a really hard time afterwards. Then, of course, Leopold and Loeb don't do much for his reputation. And then with the rise of Hitler, not Mussolini initially, who was a reader of Nietzsche and an enthusiast of Nietzsche, the rise of Hitler in particular was the more, I think, sort of the more terrifying development. So over the course of the 1930s, as we see the specter of Nazism, and then later as Americans started to see Mussolini as a greater threat than they initially had, it was not hard to find Nietzschean traces behind Nazi philosophy and Mussolini's fascism. And so lo and behold, Nietzsche, yet again is seen as the author and visionary of what would become World War II. Of course, Nietzsche wrote things that were not so hard to turn into, or to make him implicated. He wrote of the rise of the blonde beast, which people took to be his celebration of the Aryan race. His sister actually was a proto-Nazi, and in her closing years, she welcomes Hitler to the Nietzsche archive. So there's a linkage to Hitler, and some very unfortunate pictures of Hitler and Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche with the Nietzsche bust at the Nietzsche archive. So in the American imagination, Nietzsche really gets linked to World War II and the entire Nazi ideology. Here we have the Germans who didn't just want an Übermensch, but they wanted an Uber race. And we know the language of Untermenschen, the subhuman people, which was all throughout Germany during World War II. Nietzsche was just implicated in all of this.
What's his reputation today, and who's the anti-Nietzsche philosopher? Is there such a thing?
Oh, there's plenty. Yeah, but I don't think they're as interesting. Sure. I mean, George Santayana is not a thinker that we talk about much today, though we should, because he was a towering intellectual, a towering philosopher, and poet and novelist in the early 20th century. He thought Nietzsche was everything that was wrong with what he called the German mind, that hypertrophied self, the hyper-aggrandized self. He thought that what he called the German mind, or the German temperament, and he traces this back to Kant and up through Hegel, and then Nietzsche becomes the great exemplar, is an intellectual or a mind that just couldn't deal with limits. So he actually referred to Nietzsche as amateurish and adolescent. So he's pretty dismissive of Nietzsche, and that's an example of a thinker who I think is a very robust thinker and a careful thinker. There are plenty others. I actually think an interesting case here is the example of Alan Bloom, who, in the reception of his famous book, The Closing of the American Mind, a blockbuster book, Alan Bloom says, what's the wrong with higher education? It's killing the souls of our children. They're getting all of this pluralism. They're getting all this multiculturalism. But what they're not getting is great ideas. And they're not getting the challenges of those great ideas. So it's how higher education is impoverishing our nature, the souls of our children. And Nietzsche is right there all along. He even talks about the Nietzscheanization of American intellectual life. And according to Bloom, he thinks that so much of what is wrong in late 20th century intellectual life is that intellectuals are reading their Nietzsche, and kind of like what George Santayana says, they're tired of universal truth, they're tired of power, or of someone else's power, they're tired of authority. And so he says that all the counterculture of the 1960s is nursed on Nietzschean anti-authoritarianism. And he said it's one thing to have these kinds of protests in the streets, it's another thing to bring them into the academy and make such a ruckus. So he's very critical of the uses of Nietzsche. So I hit the pause button here. If you read how everyone's talking about Alan Bloom's book, and they were talking, and they were talking, and they were talking, because as you know, it was a major blockbuster. People picked up on it. Aha, you know, Nietzsche, Alan Bloom blames Nietzsche, you know, it's the Nietzscheanization of our American intellectual life, blah, 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 blah. So you would think that Alan Bloom, you know, had a problem with Nietzsche. He didn't. He thought Nietzsche was a genius. He loved Nietzsche. He wrote beautifully about Nietzsche. He wrote longingly about Nietzsche. He thought Nietzsche was a genius. And his problem was that he thought he was in a culture of intellectual pygmies who could not appreciate the genius of Nietzsche. So, and so what he's actually doing in The Closing of the American Mind, which I think is such an interesting move, he's not really blaming Nietzsche for the impoverishment of American intellectual life. Yeah, the sort of anti-authoritarianism that he finds so despicable. He's blaming, what he says is, readers who just aren't up to the task of truly understanding this great genius. So again, that's not someone who's critical of Nietzsche per se, although he has a reputation for having, you know, pinned all the failures of late 20th century American intellectual life on Nietzsche. Quite the opposite. What he's trying to do is keep his own private Nietzsche, a Nietzsche in his own image, against what he sees as the slavish, inadequate, impoverished American intellectual life that just can't handle these powerful ideas.
Jennifer Ratner Rosenhagen, you've written a biography of Friedrich Nietzsche. Are you a fan?
If I may, I would say people call it a biography of Friedrich Nietzsche, but it's actually a biography of his ideas as they come to life in America. So one of the things I say in the book is that this is not actually a book about Nietzsche. In fact, some readers have been disappointed. Of course, he crops up quite a bit. But the book is not about Nietzsche. I'm an American historian. I'm an American intellectual and cultural historian. My interest is the history of American thought and culture over 19th and 20th century. What I discovered is you can't, when you get to the late 19th century and through the 20th century, you can't talk about American intellectual life without talking about Nietzsche's presence, his curious presence, really, and his influence. So anyways, it's just a little modest correction here. It's not about Nietzsche, it's about us. So every reading of Nietzsche, I'm not listening whether H.L. Mencken or Clarence Darrow or Walter Kaufmann, who becomes so important to redeem Nietzsche after World War II, or Huey P. Newton, or Alan Bloom are getting him right or wrong. I don't think that's the interesting question for a historian to ask. What I'm trying to do is listen in to what they have to say about Nietzsche, to listen to see what that tells us about American intellectual life in that particular moment. So the book is actually not about Nietzsche, it's about us. It's about our intellectual life, and it's about our coming to our own ideas about truth, about democracy, about Christianity, about God by way of Nietzsche. But I'm dodging the question.
Has he, in your view, been a positive influence in American political and cultural life?
You know what, that's incredible. I've never been asked that question. I think he's a necessary influence because I think he's right. I mean, I think there's a lot of gunk in what he says, there's a lot of grandstanding and machismo, but you clear away some of that gunk. And the ideas, I think, are ideas that we had to come to terms with, which is, again, to just repeat what I had said earlier, the notion that so much of what we take to be universally true, whether it be God, whether it be democracy, whether it would be whatever it is, Nietzsche gave us a way of looking at those ideas, those truth claims, to see their origins and their genealogy. And Nietzsche helped Americans to see that so many truth claims are not rooted in reality. They're rooted in power. They're rooted in needs. They're rooted in fear, they're rooted in longing, but they're not necessarily rooted in truth. And I think this is necessary. I mean, for any culture, truthfully, but especially American culture, because we have from the start been a very pluralistic culture. of many languages, of many religions, of many ethnicities, of different races. And so part of what it means to be American, right from our earliest years here, is contested truths, is a pluralistic sensibility, is a land of many religions and many beliefs. And we never did a good job of negotiating, or we didn't do that great a job of negotiating this prior to Nietzsche, but his ideas become important as we negotiate this moving forward. So in answer to your question, do I think he's a positive force? Yeah, and he's also been a negative force, although he had nothing to do with it because he was long dead. And his ideas have been read in all sorts of curious ways. But I think, as I said, I think he was a necessary force, and in that regard, salutary force, because he helped Americans to confront fundamental problems that we've had, which is problems of living in a pluralistic society, and doing so in a humane way. And for that, I think, well, here I'll just speak as a historian, many people were grateful in the 20th century that they had Nietzsche to think with about these issues.
University of Wisconsin professor Jennifer Ratner Rosenhagen teaches history here at the university. Here's her book, American Nietzsche, A History of an Icon and His Ideas. You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
So, I mean, historians and philosophers debate why did he have such a tough time in the academy? Although some of us in the academy nowadays don't wonder that much. But anyway, Nietzsche taught for 10 years in Basel with some success, but due to reasons that we can only sort of imperfectly suss out, was it his health? Was it what he said, which is that he needed to break free? Nietzsche breaks free, lives on a pension the rest of his life, and gets to inhabit the image of the free thinker that he so exalts and worships in his own philosophy. But Nietzsche didn't have a huge readership for most of his productive life, and I say productive. So there he's announcing what's going to be basically his intellectual project for the rest of his writing life before he goes insane, and that is the notion that God is dead. What troubled Nietzsche was that over the course of the 19th century, as in particular Germans became more modern and more secular, that they continued to go to church and pray to a God that they didn't really believe in anymore. In other words, he thought that modern thought, modern science, the forces of modernity were undermining the basis of religion. And yet he said people still held on to it. They still clutched onto it because they were too terrified to live without it. And this he found really despicable. And that's what he, and to show that anything that we take to be universals, like, oh, God, are human creations, but they're not rooted in nature or necessity. They're not mirrors of reality.
He wrote at one time, God is dead.
And he wrote that God is dead. And this first makes its appearance in his Gay Science. And in it, the Gay Science, in it it's an aphorism, and it's called The Madman. And so the aphorism is he's playing with this idea that a madman runs into the town square and says, God is dead, God is dead, we have killed him, you and I. And everybody says, oh, he's crazy, oh, he's crazy. And he realizes, oh, my time has not come yet.
University of Wisconsin professor Jennifer Ratner Rosenhagen. Who is Friedrich Nietzsche?
Friedrich Nietzsche was a 19th century German philosopher who wrote many books of philosophy in all sorts of different forms. And all of them, so some aphoristic, some essayistic, some longer form critiques, and all of them had something to do with the challenge of universal truth. So he took as his enemy the notion of universal truth, and pretty much all of his work has something to do with his effort to tear it down, excavate it, look at the history of that idea. He tries to work out in his philosophy.
Where did he teach? How did he come about? Was he well known in his time?
Nietzsche, well, we have to sort of separate the myth from the from the reality, which is that Nietzsche did have moments of modest fame. Actually, his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, had a pretty big reception, but then he did fade into obscurity. He was a philology professor in Basel, so a professor of language, the history of language, the genealogy of language. But the academic life wasn't for him. He suffered from a lot of physical ailments,